You will not, I would think, unless you are somehow deeply involved in this, be aware of something called the Education and Training Amendment Bill number 2. It is a bill that was introduced to Parliament which amends the Education and Training Act of 2020 to give effect to new policy decisions. It has been open for submissions, which have about to close. No, they've closed. They closed this time last week, in actual fact. So once you hear this, I'm sorry you can't submit. But our next guest did. Professor Elizabeth Rata, a professor of education at the University of Auckland, who highlighted in her submission the things that need to change to get back to meritocracy being in our education and training institutes, and the, frankly, voiding of certain groups or certain ideas from serious contemplation as being somehow more important than others. And Elizabeth Rata joins us now. Professor Rata, thank you so much for coming on the show. Nice to have you on again.
Oh, morning, Michael.
Listen, as I said, most people will not be aware of the Education and Training Amendment Bill number 2. It was introduced into Parliament. I think its submissions closed, as I said, last Thursday, about almost this time last Thursday, and I guess you've put a submission into it. Could you please explain to us, I guess in the words that we would understand, Elizabeth, what the problem is with this particular piece of legislation and why you submitted on it?
The problem is that it not only retains the treaty in the legislation, but it really embeds it. I had thought that the coalition government was removing the treaty from all legislation except that concerned with treaty settlements. I don't like to overstate things, but when I say I was shocked, I actually mean shocked. Incredibly disappointed because I have great faith in the coalition government's promises. To find that the treaty is so fully embedded. In fact, the bill continues the 2020 Act, which says that the Act will establishes and regulates an education system that honours the treaty. It's as clear as that.
Yes, can I just read for our listeners one of the amendments that's in the number 2 bill to the 2020 Act to give you to illustrate exactly what you mean, and you certainly know what it is. It's section 127 2E, which I have to say it's got a certain notoriety immediately, and I'll read out exactly, because it's very short, what exactly that says. Section 127 2E provides that in meeting a paramount objective in governing a school, a board must ensure that the school gives effect to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, including by 1. Achieving equitable outcomes for Māori students, and 2. Working to ensure that its plans, policy, and teaching and learning programs reflect local tikanga Māori, Maturanga Māori, and Te Ao Māori, and taking all reasonable steps to make instruction available in tikanga Māori and Te Ao Māori. That you're absolutely right. That section is entirely opposite of what was promised to us. How do you think that section got into this particular bill, Elizabeth?
I think what happened is that treaty revisionists, and I use the term treaty revisionists, not Māori, because I would argue that most Māori do not support this approach, but treaty revisionists, those who want to establish tribal sovereignty in this country, treaty revisionists managed somehow to make a connection between the paramount objective of the bill, which is educational achievement, wonderful to see that there, and equitable outcomes, and recognising identity, ethnic identity. Now, that connection is unsubstantiated. There is no substantiated connection between educational achievement and a school system that recognises the ethnic identity of children. It's claimed, I mean, it's been claimed for 30 years, but there are no longitudinal studies that support it.
Okay.
So it's a
So,
false connection that's been made.
we've accepted as a truism, though, haven't we, that the
We
reason
have.
that Maori students don't, well, this is the argument, the reason that Maori students don't achieve in the educational system is because it is somehow biased against their culture and ethnicity. And that this is aimed to redress that. You're saying there is no empirical evidence to suggest that.
I'm saying that there have been many advocacy studies done over these decades which make the claim, but they're very small qualitative studies where a small number of people are asked, how do you feel if you're if you have an education which recognizes your culture? Well, of course, the respondents always say, oh, it would make me feel good. But real data about the causal link between achievement and policies and practices that recognize ethnic identity has not been established. It's claimed, but not established. There are no international studies that show it. There are no longitudinal studies in New Zealand. And what I say in my submission is that children, almost two generations of children now, have been subjected to what I'd call as an unconscionable experiment in this idea that if you recognize ethnic identity, that will cause educational achievement. Well, it
Yes, I'm
certainly
also,
doesn't
I'm,
seem to have because
no,
it's
no.
so
Well,
long.
I mean, Maori achievements lifted over the last, what, 30 years, since 1990. The argument is it still lags behind other ethnicities, Asian, European, or Pākehā in particular. But it's no worse than Pacific Island. Well, it's roughly about the same equivalent to Pacific Island. If Maori achievements, but that's because what we measure it differently, don't we? So the measurements in 1990, can we make strict comparisons between 1990, say, and 2025?
I think there are probably two reasons. One is that increasing numbers of Māori have moved into the professional class, and the children of the professional class, do better in education. So that
Yep.
would be one reason. Another is, how do we measure achievement? If you have a look at NCEA, for example, how do you measure a young person who has achieved excellence in, say, physics and maths and those subjects that really make huge cognitive demands in terms of abstract thinking, and young people who have taken subjects that don't do that, don't make those same cognitive demands? It could
Which
be
subjects are you thinking
in
of?
receiving credits for perhaps
Getting a driver's license.
communication studies, driver's license,
Mm.
caring for, elderly people in the community, that sort of thing, which, I mean, are very fine activities, but we can't say that they are comparable to achieving excellence in, really difficult subjects. So
What's
we
an
don't
equitable
know.
outcome? I
Um,
mean, the aim of this particular piece of legislation is in part to achieve an equitable outcome for Maori students. Now, when I read the word equitable, or maybe the English language changed since studied it at university, but equitable just simply means fair, doesn't it?
yes, yeah. Well, it should, yes, yeah.
But you're saying, well, are you saying, do you think that the word equitable suggests that you've got an actual fact to make you've got to make a difference. You've got to go one step further for Maori students in comparison to every other students. Because it would seem to me, when I look at the educational data, the Pacific Island students achieve at roughly the same rates as Maori students do. particularly an NCA, for example, results and things like that. But there's no decision to try and achieve equitable outcomes for Pacific Island students in this particular legislation or any other ethnicity. There is just one singled out.